Hi everyone, welcome to the session. This is the Mapping the UK Women and Girls Sector and its Funding session. I'm going to hand over to Kay Ali, who's one of Rosa's trustees who will chair this session. Welcome, Kay. And the other thing I'll say is please put your questions in the Q&A and we will take them later on. So do put your questions in the Q&A through this session. Thanks now.
Thank you, Louise. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Kay Ali. Given the nature of today's session, I'd like to introduce myself as a fundraiser. I've been fundraising for the last 20 years across a number of different causes, and I'm the partnerships director for one of Prince William's climate initiatives at the moment. But I'm also a really proud trustee of Rosa, so I'm really thrilled to be able to chair today's session and to meet so many of you. I'm really delighted to be joined by Lorna Dorwick and Kathy Harris from Sheffield Hallam University and Rebecca Gill, Rosa's Chief Executive, and we'll be hearing from all of them later today. I have to leave at 12:30, but I will hand back over to Louise for the Q&A session at the end before I leave. So this piece of research that we'll be talking about today is a really, really important piece of research for Rosa and for the women and girls sector. So Rosa exists to bring additional funding into the women and girls sector. And as a long-standing trustee of Rosa, it's still really shocking for me to see evidence of how little funding is still going into the sector. Rosa aims to use its voice to achieve change, and our hope is very much that this report will help convince funders to see why it's so important to invest more in the women and girls sector and organisations, and to help support women and girls organisations to really help make that case for support for funding. I'd like to now hand over to Lorna and Kathy from Sheffield Hallam.
Hi, thank you. That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Kay. We're really really happy to be here. So I'll just introduce myself and Kathy can introduce herself, and then we'll get started with showing some slides about the report. So I'm Lorna Dowrick, and I am based at Sheffield Hallam University. Kathy?
Yeah, I'm Kathy Harris. I'm also based at Sheffield Hallam University in the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research. I'm a research fellow there.
That's great. So if you just bear with me, I will share our slides. Can everybody see that okay? Yeah, brilliant. So firstly, thank you very much for inviting us here. We're delighted to be able to join the conference and to provide an overview of the research that we undertook, commissioned by Rosa, the National Lottery and the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. And the research was undertaken by Dr. Chris Dam, who's unfortunately not able to be here today, myself and Kathy Harris. And as Kathy said, we're all based at the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research at Sheffield Hallam. So to give you a bit of short bit of background about the research, it was commissioned by the funders who identified a real lack of information about funding to the sector and how they could best support the work of the women and girls sector, and they wanted to better understand who the organisations are and what resources are available to them and how they're being distributed across the sector. So building on some research that I undertook as part of my PhD to identify women and girls organisations, we used a wide variety of data sources, including charity commission data, data on 360 Giving, which records grants to organisations, Contracts Finder, and Companies House data. And we used all of these data sources to build a picture of which organisations we could find that were women and girls organisations and the sort of levels of funding that they'd received. So we did that through a kind of process of using keyword searches through the data sets and then kind of manually verifying and checking the results. And we particularly focused on the year 2021. So the data that you'll see us sharing is from that year. So through the research, we were able to identify 7,396 women and girls organisations that were active in 2021. And the majority of those were charities, as you can see from this graphic. Most were registered with the Charity Commission for England and Wales, the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator, and the Charity Commission for Northern Ireland. So those are the top three figures on that line. The remaining organisations were community interest companies and a small number of registered societies. So the charity register, as you can see from the previous slide, kind of provides the kind of biggest number of organisations that are women and girls organisations. So the Charity Commission data was a kind of focus for some of the research and the findings that we're sharing today. So as a proportion of the wider voluntary and community sector, women and girls charities represent 3.5% of the total sector. In terms of income, their proportion, however, is smaller, and they are just 2% of the total charity income, suggesting that they're smaller by income size than would be expected. They also importantly have a very large number of volunteers at 6.6%, which is greater than their proportion as a number of organisations. So this would suggest that there's a greater number of volunteers concentrated in women and girls organisations. After we'd identified the women and girls organisations, we ought to also categorise them to look at the kind of range of themes and issues that they covered. It was really wide ranging, as you might expect, ranging from things like social, arts organisations, sports organisations, through to kind of organisations providing a lot of services, such as ending violence against women and girls organisations, international organisations, and a lot of others in between. So this chart here shows the proportion of women and girls organisations that are charities, and it shows them as a percentage of all of those organisations, what the percentage of income is and what their percentage is as a number. And from this, we can see that social organisations at the top there represent a small percentage of the income for women and girls organisations, but a much greater percentage by number of organisations. And you can see that as a kind of almost reverse scenario for the next line down, which is the ending violence against women and girls organisations, who have a much larger proportion of the income that goes to women and girls charities, but are a much smaller in number. And generally, there are a range of organisations which have a higher percentage of income, such as those providing the specialist services. And that would kind of to be expected due to the kind of higher running costs associated with those kind of organisations providing important services, and the kind of some of the other organisations providing really important social activities and so on may not have such a large income. The micro and small organisations accounted for 3.9% of all income for women and girls organisations, and they are 86.5% of the sector by number. So they are a predominant big chunk, if you like, of the women and girls sector, but with a smaller, much smaller kind of proportion of the income. Women and girls charities are generally smaller than charities overall. And the research identified that there are a larger percentage of these micro-organisations at 68% versus 39% for the sector as a whole. Women and girls charities also have a smaller percentage of major or super major organisations. So only 0.2% of women and girls charities were major or super major organisations, which are those in the much larger income category, whereas in the sector as a whole is around 0.9% of the sector. I'm now going to hand over to Kathy. Kathy's going to talk us through some of the findings around the funding to the sector.
Thanks, Lana. Just checking I'm not on mute there. Yeah, so from the 360 Giving database, we were able to sort of do some analysis of the grants that are going to women and girls organisations. So we identified that there was a total of 1,799 grants, which were worth £73.4 million. And these grants were made directly to 1,305 women and girls organisations and that's all for the year 2021. So obviously they sound like quite big numbers, but when you look at the total number of grants awarded overall to all organisations, there were 55,500 grants worth a total of 4.1 billion. So that actually means that only a very small proportion of grants, 1.8% of the total value, went to women and girls organisations themselves. Interestingly, we identified that quite a significant proportion of grants for women and girls work were actually awarded to non-women and girls organisations, and this was around a third of the total value of grants for women and girls work. Could you move on to the next slide, Lorna? Thanks. Brilliant. So in terms of the value of grants, the majority of grants to women and girls organisations tended to be at the lower end of the scale in terms of value. So over half of the grants to women and girls organisations were below £10,000 in value. And if you look at the table in the bottom right hand corner, you can see that the median value of grants to women and girls organisations is similar to the median value of all grants at just under 10,000. Sorry. Thanks. But if you calculate the average using the mean, you can see that this is higher for all grants compared to women and girls organisation grants. So what this means is women and girls organisations receive fewer of the very large grants. So you can see on the graph at the top of the page that there's a very small number of grants of over £1 million that in the data as a whole, but none of these are to women and girls organisations. Next slide, Lorna, please. Thank you. So in terms of looking at this graph basically gives you an idea of the number and the value of grants across each different type of organisation. So the pink bars show the number of grants awarded to each type of organisation, and the orange bars show the value of these grants. I won't go through the whole chart, but just to pull out a couple of sort of interesting points. So similar to the graph that Lorna showed earlier, you can see that the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls organisations receive a large amount of grant funding in terms of both number and value of these grants. But the value of the grants they receive is higher overall is higher in proportion to the number of grants that they receive. So yeah, again, this is perhaps a reflection of the high cost of the services that they provide. Projects for minoritized women and girls receive the next highest amount of funding. And health and social organisations receive a relatively high number of grants, but these tended to be lower in value. I guess just a word of caution on this graph, it doesn't sort of tell us anything about the level of need in any way. So I guess just because one category receives more funding than another, it doesn't tell us whether either or any type of organisation is actually adequately funded. So yeah. Okay, final slide. Okay, so I'll just whiz through a few of our key recommendations to finish off. So we face quite a lot of challenges in pulling together the data, just in terms of the availability of the data and the consistency and completeness of the data where it was available. So for example, with the 360 Giving data, most of the central government data hadn't been published on 360 Giving at that point. So the totals for those are likely to be different to what we were actually able to analyse. So some of our recommendations are kind of data focused. So we would recommend that basic information on sort of total income, main income sources and activities for all BCSE organisations should be collected by regulators. It would be helpful to have kind of an identifier for women and girls organisations that are incorporated into classification systems used by charity regulators, because they don't exist at the moment. Also, so not all organisations submit data to 360 Giving, and those that do, like I said, don't necessarily do so in a timely fashion. So it'd be helpful if that could be improved to allow the data to be as sort of useful and accurate as possible. We also have a set of recommendations that are focused on the funding of women and girls organisations. So we'd recommend more funding focused directly on supporting women and girls, more funding that allows staffing and core costs to be covered, specific funding opportunities for women and girls organisations rather than women and girls work in general, continuing funding of the sort of full diverse range of activities supported by grant makers, ensuring accessibility of government contracts to women and girls organisations, and further longitudinal research to track changes over time and more in-depth exploration of subsections of the sector that we've mentioned. Okay. And so the last slide, we just wanted to kind of draw attention to the mapping tool. So as part of the research, we produced it's an interactive dashboard which allows you to map women and girls charities geographically. So this is just a screen grab of the homepage, but we've got the link to it up there as well. So you can use the filters down the left-hand side of the page to select a particular region or a local authority, and you can also filter by sort of different types or sizes of women and girls charities to explore the data geographically. And that's it, I think. I think we might be about on time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy and Lorna. Hey, should I do my section? Okay, you're on mute. Can you not unmute yourself? Is that the issue?
Oh, here we go. Maybe I've unmuted now. Yeah, sorry, I have to wait for the host to unmute me. It's okay. Thank you so much, Lorna and Kathy. That was really interesting. I can see that there's been lots of questions as well in the chat, which is really great. We'll have an opportunity to answer the questions. But yeah, at this point, I will hand over to Rebecca, who's going to reflect on what this research means for the sector.
Thanks, Kay, and thanks for everyone for bearing with us while we fight the battle with Zoom. So we're really grateful to the work that Lorna and Kathy have done, and Christopher at Sheffield Hallam. When we worked with Lottery and Esme Fairburn on this programme, on this project, we were looking for a number. And we were looking for a number because what we were hearing, what Rosa was hearing from women and girls organisations was consistently, we cannot get funding. Our funding is under threat. We can't raise enough money. And what we were hearing consistently from the funders, of which we are one, is we've got a proud record of funding the women and girls sector. And we were thinking there is some space here where the money's going out, but it's not going to the organisations. And we really wanted to understand, therefore, from the funder perspective, where is the money going? So it was very deliberately a piece of work from that funder perspective. And we knew the number would be low, but we were not expecting less than 2% of all charitable grants to be going to the women and girls sector. And that for us feels shocking. perhaps not unsurprising, maybe. But also it gives us a benchmark. It gives us something to work with and to say, we don't actually think that's enough. Women and girls charities make up 3.5% of the charitable sector, and we are getting less than 2% of the funding. So we're very delighted to have that number, but as ever with these pieces of research, it raises more questions than it answers. I think for us, as well as the importance of the funding, there are questions about why 86% of women's organisations are micro. And we know that for lots of women's organisations, particularly those that are working in particular geographic locations, trying to solve very, very specific challenges and advocate for very specific groups of women, they might want to stay small. But our concern, based on the figures that we've seen and what's been highlighted by this research, is that women's organisations are small, that they're seen to be small by other funders, and that funders feel that they can't therefore take on more money. And therefore you end up in this space where women's organisations are small and they remain small. And Rosa can't solve all of those problems, but we are very, very keen on working with the funding sector to understand how we can address those issues and enable organisations not just to survive, but to thrive. And obviously larger grants, long-term funding, funding for core activity are all critical to that, that piece of, that way forward. And that's something that Rosa wants to work with funders to enable that to happen. I noticed there was a question in the chat, which is something I wanted to touch on, which is about this issue of why is this third of funding going to women's focused work, but not for women's organisations. And the work that Kathy and Lorna have done have highlighted that's about, about 24 million pounds a year in charitable grants is going to those organisations. And the concern that we have at Rosa is that those organisations, and the work is often done by brilliant charities, but they're not women's organisations. And they might well be working on very, very important issues, have a long and proud history of working on issues with young people, with homeless, with, advice services and so on. But they are not women and girls organisations. And the challenge we have is what we know at Rosa is the history of progress in women's rights, in law, in culture, in practice over the last 200 years in the United Kingdom. Every single element of progress has been won by women mobilising and organising. That is the strength of the women and girls sector, and that is why we need funding to go to women-led organisations, because when it goes to gender neutral organisations, it solves a problem, but actually those organisations are not at the forefront of progress and change for women and girls. And when maybe the fashions move on or the money runs out, those organisations will move on, but women and girls organisations are still here, and we are always here. And that is our power, that is our superpower, and that's actually why the funding needs to go to organisations that are led by women, for women and girls. And that's something that we really want to draw attention to at Rosa, and it's it's no way a criticism of other organisations, but it really is. There is a greater power to investing in women and girls organisations because we know their historical significance and we know their current significance, and we know that they are still standing when other people have taken their wagons out of town. And I don't want to talk for too long because I really want to hear what people's questions are and so on. But we are going to be conducting more research based on the findings from this mapping research. And one of the first things we're going to be doing is we want to find out from the women and girls sector what your opportunities are at the moment and what your challenges are. So the next piece of research is, in a sense, looking at the other end of the telescope. We've tried to identify what's happening in the funding world, and now we want to understand the perspective of women and girls organisations. And so do sign up to Rosa's newsletter, so you can receive emails from us and find out how you can participate in our next piece of research. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was really inspiring. It was brilliant. Thanks so much. I've noticed on the chat that quite a lot of people are asking where they can access the report and the mapping tool and this deck. So hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about that at the Q&A. At this point, unfortunately, I have to drop off. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you all today, hear from Lorna and Kathy on the research and from you, Rebecca. I'm going to hand over to Louise now, who will lead the Q&A session, but thank you all so much.
Hi, everyone. We've now got a session opportunity to ask some questions of the researchers and of Rebecca, and I can see that there's some questions in the chat. Just to say before we start, I have posted a link in the chat to the research and the mapping tool, and we will do that again at the end of the session, just so that you've got that. And for those of you who've been asking questions about where they find out more about the research. So I can see there's a number of questions in the chat. If I just take the first one for Lorna and Kathy, there's been a question about who was included as social organisations in the research. So it'd be useful to hear more about that from you, if that's possible. So who fit into the social category? And Lorna's going to ask that one, answer that one, I think, if she's unmuted. Just bear with us. I would just say in the research there's a more detailed explanation of each of the categories that we've got in there. Oh, Lorna, you seem to be unmuted now.
I'm unmuted now, sorry. So just to, the social category tends to be organisations that are things like women's institutes, girl guides, organisations that are very much focused on providing social activities. So it could be kind of small community groups of women. They're separate from what we call general welfare organisations, which are kind of women's organisations that provide a wide range of services as well as social activities. So the social activities category are just those that are providing social spaces, organisations that provide a wider range of services. So they might provide some social space, but also kind of advice and service provision. They would be in the general welfare category. So I think sometimes it's useful to make a distinction between those two groups.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Lorna. The next question that we've had is how you define micro and small organisations by turnover. It would be helpful if you could explain a little bit about how you categorised organisations within the research for size, income size.
Yeah, I can do that as well. So while I'm unmuted. So micro organisations, these terms come from the National Council of Voluntary Organisations. They have a way where they produce something called the Almanac, which is a kind of summary of where the wider voluntary and community sector is every year, which is really interesting if people want to have a look at that on their website. But we've used their same categories so that we could do comparison with their research. So micro organisations are those with an income under £10,000 a year. Small organisations are 10,000 to 100,000. Is that right, Kathy? And it goes up in increments like that. Yeah, so 100,000 to a million would be the next category, medium.
That's really helpful, Lorna. Thanks for that. And I can see that Stacey's asked a question about whether this includes local authority and government grants in the research. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about how we try to find out more about local authority and government grants. That would be really helpful.
Kathy, do you want a turn at speaking?
Yeah, that would be great, Kathy. You seem to be unmuted. Brilliant.
I am unmuted. Yeah. There was so we obviously did our best to kind of find all of the data that we could to kind of include things like local authority and central government kind of grants. But as I kind of mentioned a little bit briefly, within sort of the grant funding data that we had, for example, from 360 Giving, there was quite a bit missing within that data. So that's kind of one of our key recommendations, is to try and improve the data in terms of to help us to understand that more fully, because yes, there was a little bit missing in terms of, well, quite a bit missing in terms of what was available to us for analysis. I don't know if you wanted to add anything else on that, Lorna.
No, I think thinking about the 360 Giving data, there wasn't an awful lot of local authority funding on there in that data set. And we were able to get some information, obviously, through the Charity Commission data.
Yeah.
Louise, can I just quickly come in on that?
Yeah, that'd be really helpful, Rebecca. Yeah.
I think it's to say that one of the recommendations from the research, which we're really keen to pursue at Rosa, is actually, it's quite a technical thing, but it's actually how funders tag their funding. And Kathy did mention this in her presentation, but we really want to encourage all funders, government, statutory agencies, and trusts and foundations, anyone, to use better methods of showing when their money is going to women and girls organisations, not just because it makes our lives a lot easier, but actually because I think there's an element around transparency. And I think that when women make up 51% of the population, women and girls, then actually there should be an onus on funders to be able to say that their money is going to those organisations and to organisations that represent them. So it's just something that Rosa, that we're really picking up and working out how we can run with. And any funders that are here today, anyone who has connections to sort of statutory agencies and so on, to try and get them to tag that information more clearly, so that that process of transparency can begin. Because it feels small, but actually it could have a huge impact on us just understanding where the money is going.
And that follows on quite nicely, Rebecca, to another question that we've had, where someone's commented that they find it interesting that just over 3% of the charitable sector is defined as women and girls charities. Could it be that there are more organisations that fit this category that aren't being counted? I would just say that the researchers spent an awful lot of time trying to find organisations and identify them, and that leads on to the point that you've made about how if organisations are easier to identify and funders are putting that information in there, then it's easier to count them. So we've done our very best to identify organisations, but with the limitations with the data, we would say that can be a little difficult. Didn't know if anyone wanted to say anything else on that. And we have got some recommendations in the research about data and about how data is categorised, and that might be interesting for people to look at. I've got another question in the chat from Umi about whether we mapped the funding to women and girls sector geographically. Kathy, would you like to say something on that?
Yeah, sure. So we have the map, obviously the mapping tool that we briefly looked at the end. So that shows all of the women and girls charities geographically. So yeah, that is available. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for that.
We also did some on the we did some geographical stuff that's within the report, but we didn't have time to include it in the slides. But within the reports, there's also some further data on geographical spread of organisations that might be of interest to look at.
Yeah,
there's also
been quite a lot more in the report, sorry, than we were able to cover. So I would definitely encourage people to have a look through, and we're more than welcome to receive additional questions.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I noticed there's another question in the chat, which was, how are you defining a grant? So it might be helpful to talk a little bit about how we identified what a grant was through the process. Kathy, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, I think it might not be a straightforward answer. So sometimes in the data, people have identified that they received grants, whereas others may have categorized things as contracts, I think. This might be more of a question for Chris. I don't know, unfortunately he's not here, but I mean, certainly the 360 Giving database is specifically focused on grant funding, but yeah, it's a bit of a wishy-washy answer, I think. I don't know, Lorna, do you have any more thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think within the charity commission data, organisations earning over a particular threshold give additional information about where their funding comes from, and they can they can categorise that under grants, contracts, donations, that kind of thing. And sometimes people can have a different perspective on what they as an organisation perceive that funding to have been, and that we can't capture that. We have to take it as what's presented within the data. If they've categorised that as a grant, we counted it as a grant. I hope that makes sense.
That's brilliant, thank you. I can see there's another questions being asked about whether we were able to identify rural women as one of the categories. Don't know if you want to answer that. It might be worth mentioning how people can use the tool at this point as well. Might be worth just mentioning in relation to that. Lorna, would you like to do that one?
Yeah, no, I mean, you can, we haven't particular, I don't think we did a chart on rural urban, although we would be able to do that based on the data we've got. But the tool, you can have a look by area, by local authority areas, and look, and it will tell you which organisations are within those locations. There are some organisations that are not included on there because we felt that their location information was sensitive. So just to flag that up, but it gives you a good idea of what organisations are in which areas. That's
really helpful. Well, I think we've run out of time to answer any more of the questions being put in, and they're really stimulating, and we'd love to answer them all. I would say to people, do have a look at the research report, because some of the questions that you've asked in there about categorisation and things like that are answered in the report. And I can see Lorna's got her hand up at this point. Yes, Lorna, go on.
Sorry, there's just one question I did spot, which I thought was important to address, and that was around the kind of the chart that showed the proportion of income going to organisations supporting Black and minoritized women and girls. And I just wanted to clarify that because that category includes all organisations working with Black and minoritized women and girls, it cuts across all of those other categories. So, for example, if it was an international organisation or an ending violence against women and girls organisation specifically for Black and minoritized women and girls, it would be within that that category. And so what that does is it makes that category quite large, and because of the kind of variation in size of types of organisation within that, that's why it's kind of higher up the chart than would be expected, if that makes sense. Yes, really, I just wanted to clarify that for people, because I think that's that's a really helpful answer, Lorna. Thank you for that one. So we're going to close this session now. It just leaves me to thank Lorna, Kathy, Rebecca and Kay, who chaired the session, and thanks to everyone for the questions. You can download a copy of the research report, and you can look at the mapping tool on Rosa's website, and I have put a link to that in the chat. We are going to have another session now. There's a lunchtime break, but you can also go and talk to a number of Rosa's grantees in rooms. We're doing a virtual meeting place, so do please take advantage to that. So it's a lunch and meet the grantees session, which will go until 1:15, and then at 1:15 we'll have a funders panel. I'd just like to thank everyone for coming along today. It's been a really stimulating session, so thanks for your time. Bye now, everyone. Bye bye. Take care.